In the sedition trial that got underway today in Washington, D.C., the biggest sedition trial in America in 80 years, of 5 members of the right-wing pro-Trump paramilitary group, the Oath Keepers, including their leader. There's not much in dispute about the facts of the case. The Oath Keepers did descend on D.C. on January 6th. They brought guns and ammo and even hand grenades with them. Today, prosecutors played an audio recording of the group's leader, regretting they didn't bring the guns to the Capitol itself. They played a recording of him saying, quote, "My only regret is they should have brought rifles. We could have fixed it right there and then." Oath Keepers in their little fake military uniforms, they definitely did storm into the Capitol in military formation. Prosecutors say once inside, they split up into 2 teams, fanning out to go hunt down individual lawmakers. And after January 6th, the group's leader definitely did keep buying weapons and messaging fellow Oath Keepers about continuing to try to block President Biden from taking office. None of that is really in dispute in this trial. New York Times reporter Alan Foyer, who was in the courthouse as the sedition trial kicked off today, he put it this way. He said, quote, he said, quote, "Because of the government's wealth of evidence, the trial is less likely to focus on disputes over what the group did in the days and weeks leading up to January 6th than it is to hinge on the question of why they did it." Joining us now is Alan Foyer. He's covering the trial for the New York Times. Mr. Foyer, I appreciate you being here. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
So can you explain that last point, that the dispute in the courtroom is going to be less about what they did and more about why they did it? Why is that?
Sure. So it's going to get down to a question of intent, right? So there's tons of evidence that after the election, Stewart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, was very vocal about not wanting to let Joe Biden get into office. The government says that is evidence that they had a conspiracy afoot to stop the lawful transfer of power. The defense says, no, that's more of a free speech issue. The why of it, the government, no one disputes that the Oath Keepers, had this armed quick reaction force stationed in hotel rooms across the Potomac River in Virginia, kind of at the ready should things go wrong on January 6th. And, the government says, hey, that's evidence that they had this plot afoot to stop the transfer of power again. The defense says, no, it had nothing to do with that. Those armed Oath Keepers were stationed in those hotel rooms awaiting orders from President Trump to invoke a revolutionary-era law called the Insurrection Act that would have given them the legal standing as a militia to come to Trump's aid. Again, it's a question of intent.
In terms of that Insurrection Act argument, sometimes the way these things go in federal trials, I know, is that the judge will rule in advance. He or she will hear motions in advance about essentially the admissibility of a particular argument in addition to the admissibility of particular evidence. Sometimes a judge will rule, yes, you can make that kind of argument. No, you can't make that kind of argument. Has this issue of the Insurrection Act potentially sort of legalizing their otherwise illegal actions, is that something that has been litigated thus far in the trial, or is this essentially them trying it for the first time in front of the jury and nobody quite knows if it's going to fly?
It was absolutely litigated beforehand. The judge set kind of specific limits on how this defense could be raised. And again, it had to be raised as an issue of intent. There is a defense called a public authority defense where someone charged with a crime says, hey, I thought I was following the law when I was breaking this crime, or I thought I was acting under the authority of a government official. And that's a sort of closely related but separate thing. What the Oath Keepers are saying here is they believed, in their minds, they believed that it would have been legal for them to bring their weapons over the river and come to the aid of their compatriots at the Capitol had Trump invoked the Insurrection Act. And what's interesting about that, aside from the sort of novel and very risky, frankly, defense they're raising is, you mentioned before, that there have been sedition cases in the past, going back, Civil War cases through, the Wobblies, the radical unionists, through sort of war resistors, on up to Islamic terrorists. No one charged with seditious conspiracy has ever tried to ally themselves with the chief executive of the government while charged with seeking to use force against the government. That's the real kind of weird and new thing here.